After 25 years of top sales, I was fired by a new young boss. He said, "Old people are no longer needed." I signed the papers. My name is John Carter, and at 52, I'd already spent 28 years working for Comtech Industries, one of the largest tech supply companies in the Northeast. Back when I started, I was just a kid trying to get by, fresh out of a community college with a degree in business management and nothing more than a handful of student loans to my name. But I learned quickly, and I worked harder. By the time I hit my 30s, I was a force to be reckoned with in the sales department, and by 40, I was senior account manager. In the world of sales, there are always new faces, but for the most part, I built a reputation. When I walked into a room, I didn't need to brag about my accomplishments. My numbers spoke for themselves. Over the years, I built up an impressive list of clients. You might not recognize their names if you're not in the business, but they were the backbone of the industry, loyal, dependable, and high profile. The contracts I managed, the deals I sealed, they were the reason Comtech stayed afloat during some of the roughest market shifts. We had a reputation for reliability, for integrity, and for service that went above and beyond. I prided myself on that reputation. It wasn't built on fancy tricks or glossy marketing campaigns. I didn't chase after every trend like some of the younger guys in the office. I kept things simple, effective. I knew the old school methods worked. Be honest, show up on time, build trust, follow through. Those were the things that kept clients coming back year after year. The younger guys always liked to joke about how I did things the old-fashioned way, but to me that wasn't a criticism. It was a point of pride. I didn't need to overcomplicate things with gimmicks and social media hacks. My track record was solid. I didn't need to move with the times because the times moved with me. And for the most part, that was enough. I was the dependable guy that you could count on when everything else fell apart. Then a few months ago, everything changed. The company hired a new manager. His name was Kyle Richardson, and he was fresh out of a business school, barely 29 years old. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for fresh perspectives and new ideas. The world is constantly changing, and there's always something to be learned from the younger generation. But there's a difference between bringing in new ideas and trying to tear down everything that came before you just because it's not your idea. Kyle's first day in the office was the first time I really understood what it felt like to be an old dog in a young world. He came in with his slick suit and his flashy presentation, full of jargon that made my head spin. "We need to disrupt the market," he said in a meeting. "We need to innovate, to pivot, to grow exponentially. Old methods are holding us back." Now, I've been around long enough to know that disruption is just a fancy word for doing something that sounds important but doesn't necessarily work. But Kyle didn't seem to care about the numbers, about the actual results. He was obsessed with the image, with how things looked rather than how they actually functioned. For the first few weeks, I kept my distance, doing my work as usual. I didn't pay much attention to the buzzwords he was tossing around or the new strategies he'd been trying to implement. But then things started to change in subtle ways. I'd walk into the break room, and Kyle would be in there, talking about leveraging synergies and optimizing performance. I'd shake my head, grab my coffee, and get back to work. I knew my job. I didn't need to hear another motivational speech from a kid who'd never even held a client meeting by himself. But then one day, it happened. I was called into one of those mandatory strategy meetings where Kyle was going over the new direction for the company. I knew the drill. New management comes in, they have 100 ideas, and you just nod along, pretending to agree. But this time, Kyle's comments hit a little too close to home. "John," he said in front of the entire sales team, "I've been looking over some of your client reports. You've been doing well, but I think it's time we move away from these old-fashioned methods of relationship building. We need to get with the times. More social media engagement, more automated outreach. That's where the future is. We can't just rely on face-to-face meetings anymore. It's a digital world now, and we need to innovate." I could feel the blood rise to my cheeks. The room went quiet. The other guys in the office exchanged glances, probably wondering how I was going to respond. I stayed calm. I had to. I knew Kyle was just doing what he thought was best, but what he didn't realize was that I had years of experience under my belt. I'd been in this business long before social media became the latest craze. I knew what worked and what didn't, and I knew that relationships weren't built with hashtags or automated emails. Relationships were built on trust. They were built by showing up, shaking hands, and keeping promises. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded. I understand, Kyle, I said, keeping my voice steady, but I still believe in the personal touch. The clients I've worked with for years, they trust me because they know I'm going to deliver, not because I sent them a tweet. Kyle smirked. Well, that's the problem, John. You're stuck in the past. If you can't adapt, I'm afraid you won't fit into our vision for the future. The room was still silent. I could feel every eye on me. Kyle wasn't just challenging my methods, he was challenging my experience, my whole career. The thought that I wasn't innovating the way he wanted felt like a slap in the face. But I held it together. After all, I was the senior account manager. I'd been in the business longer than Kyle had been alive. This was just another phase. He'd eventually realized that the new way wasn't the best way. But as I left that meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. It was like the walls were closing in, and I was starting to see just how out of place I had become. It didn't take long for Kyle to make his intentions clear. At first, it was the little things. He'd walk past my desk and toss off a sarcastic comment, or make a joke about my old-school methods in front of the team. It wasn't overt, not yet, but it was a pattern. Small digs, little reminders that I wasn't with the times. And at first, I told myself it didn't matter. After all, I'd been at this for decades. Kyle was just a kid trying to prove himself, right? He didn't understand the long game. He'd learn eventually. But the comments started getting sharper. One Monday morning, I walked into a team meeting, and as I sat down, I heard Kyle's voice cutting through the air. "So, John," he said, all smooth confidence, "I've been going over some of your client reports. I see you're still handling most of them the old-fashioned way. Lots of in-person meetings, no real social media interaction, no email blasts. The digital age, John. You have to evolve. You're just not reaching the audience like you could be." The entire room was silent. Everyone knew me. They knew my work ethic. They knew my results. I didn't need to send mass emails or post LinkedIn updates every week. My clients trusted me because they knew I cared about their business, not because I could put out a catchy post about their company. But Kyle was on a roll. "Maybe it's time we considered a new approach. I don't know how much longer this personal touch thing will hold up. We need data-driven results, not just handshakes." I could feel the sting of his words, but I kept my face neutral. "You might be right, Kyle," I said, trying to deflect the blow. "The industry is changing, but I'll tell you this. My clients appreciate a personal phone call, not an algorithm." There was a slight shift in the room. Some of the younger guys chuckled, probably thinking I was out of touch. But the older members of the team, the ones who had been there as long as I had, exchanged a few glances. No one wanted to step in, though. No one wanted to go against the boss. So I stayed quiet, took my lumps, and hoped it would blow over. But it didn't. It only got worse. I started noticing that Kyle would call me out more and more in front of the team. Every time we had a meeting, he'd mention my methods in the same breath as outdated or ineffective. If I made a suggestion during a strategy discussion, he'd roll his eyes as if my experience didn't count for anything. The worst part was when he started to pull me out of client meetings. At first, it was subtle. He'd take over the call, even though it was my client. He'd jump in with his digital marketing pitch or analytics jargon, acting like he was the expert, even though he didn't know the first thing about building relationships. The clients didn't like it. I could see it in their faces when Kyle would start talking, pushing his ideas like they were the holy grail. They didn't care about social media reach. They didn't care about conversion rates. They just wanted results, and that's where I excelled. But Kyle was on a mission. He didn't just want to change things. He wanted to replace me. It all came to a head during one of our quarterly reviews. We were all gathered in the conference room, Kyle, me, and the rest of the team. The numbers on the screen were the usual. Solid sales, satisfied clients, the kind of numbers that kept the company in business. But Kyle wasn't impressed. "John," he said, looking at me over his laptop, "these numbers are fine, but you're not moving fast enough. I see you're hitting the targets, but you're not doing it the right way. We need more data-driven sales strategies, not just relying on old methods. And to be honest, it's starting to hold us back. My heart was pounding. There it was, right in front of everyone. The accusation, the suggestion that everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, wasn't good enough anymore. I tried to keep my cool. Kyle, I've been here almost 3 decades. I know these clients. I've been working with them longer than you've been working here. They trust me because they know I can get the job done, not because of some algorithm or shiny new tool. Kyle didn't even flinch. You don't get it, John, he said, his voice condescending. We're moving into a new era, and you're stuck in the past. If you can't adapt, then maybe you're not cut out for this anymore. The room went silent again. I could feel the weight of his words, and I could see the smirk forming at the corners of his lips. He wasn't just disagreeing with me, he was pushing me out. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about him proving a point, about showing who was in charge. Maybe it's time we parted ways, John, Kyle said, his voice like ice. I'm not sure you belong here anymore. I stared at him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd given this company everything. I'd made sacrifices, lost time with my family, missed vacations, stayed late for meetings and calls, all for the company. And now this kid, this green, inexperienced punk, was telling me I didn't belong? I stayed silent for a moment, taking in the insult. Then in a calm voice that surprised even me, I said, You're right, Kyle. Maybe I don't belong here anymore. And with that, I walked out of the room. I won't lie to you, those first few weeks after I walked out of the office were tough. The initial shock of being pushed out, of being replaced by someone half my age, lingered. And of course, the self-doubt crept in. I'd spent my entire career with one company, one path, one identity. What now? I was in my 50s, too old to be looking for another corporate job, especially in a world that seemed to value speed, innovation, and data over experience. For the first time in my life, I felt like a relic. The world had moved on, and I hadn't been invited to the party. I spent the first few weeks at home, doing the usual, watching TV, checking job boards, and trying to keep my mind busy. But I wasn't fooling myself. It wasn't about a paycheck anymore. It was about purpose. I had been a player, an expert in my field. Now I was sitting on the sidelines. The bills were starting to stack up, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't sit around forever. So I started thinking about what I knew, about what I could do. My entire career had been built on relationships, on understanding people, their needs, and what they valued. I didn't need fancy algorithms or digital marketing tactics. I knew how to sell, how to connect. That's when the idea hit me. I could start my own business. I wasn't sure exactly what it would look like, but I knew I had enough experience to offer something. Maybe I could start a consulting firm, help smaller businesses with what I knew. Client relations, sales strategies, building long-term trust. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't going to make me a tech millionaire, but it could work. So I took the plunge. I rented a small office space. Not much, just enough to have a desk, a phone, and a place to meet with clients. I didn't have a marketing budget or a fancy website. Hell, I didn't even have a social media profile at first. I just had me and my experience. The first few months were a grind. I didn't have a client base, and every lead felt like pulling teeth. I called old contacts, friends, anyone who might remember me from the industry. I offered free consultations, hoping to build up a reputation. But nothing came easy. For a while, it felt like the entire world had forgotten about me. I was just another middle-aged guy trying to make a living in a world that didn't want to listen. But I kept pushing. Every small victory meant something. Every phone call that turned into a meeting. Every meeting that turned into a paid consultation. Slowly, my reputation started to build, piece by piece. I wasn't flashy, I didn't make promises I couldn't keep, but I was honest and people appreciated that. And then, one day it happened. I got my first real client, someone who wasn't a friend or a former colleague, someone who actually wanted my services. I was over the moon. It wasn't a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but for me, it was everything. It was proof that I was doing something right, and it gave me the momentum I needed to keep going. From there, things started to snowball. My client base grew. Word-of-mouth recommendations came in. People realized that I wasn't just a relic of the past. I was someone who could offer real value based on years of experience and a commitment to the long term. I wasn't going to be a tech guru, but I didn't need to be. I was a master of relationships, and I knew how to build trust, something that couldn't be measured by a set of analytics or a click-through rate. My clients weren't just numbers to me, they were people, and that's what I built my business on. But it wasn't just about getting clients. It was about staying in business. Every new client was a step forward, but there were still days when I wondered if it would ever be enough. There were still the doubts, the fear that maybe, just maybe, I had missed my window, that I was still stuck in the past. Then something changed. After a couple of years, I had enough clients to hire a couple of employees. Not a huge team, just a few people who shared my values and were committed to the long game. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also one of the most rewarding. I was building something from the ground up, and this time, I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I felt like I had my second chance. Years passed, and my business slowly but surely began to flourish. It wasn't the quick climb of a tech startup or the kind of flashy success you read about in the news. No, it was a steady rise, one built on trust, experience, and a relentless commitment to delivering results. And while I wasn't out there chasing venture capital or seeking investors, I was building a reputation in my own right. It was a typical Tuesday morning when one of my old contacts from the industry, someone I'd worked with years ago, came into my office. His name was Tom, a former colleague from my previous job. He had been a mid-level manager when I was with the company, and now he was sitting across from me in a slightly too small chair, nervously shifting his weight from side to side. "John," he said, clearing his throat, "I've been hearing a lot about you lately. Word's getting around. Seems like you've really built something impressive here." I wasn't sure if I should feel flattered or suspicious. It was rare that I heard anything positive about the old company anymore. Most people just talked about Kyle's big innovations and all the newfangled tactics he was throwing around. But Tom wasn't done yet. "I've got to be honest with you," he continued, leaning in a little closer. "I don't know if you've heard, but things aren't going too well over at the old place. Kyle's, well, things aren't working out like he thought they would. The clients are leaving. They don't like the changes, and the results just aren't there." I nodded, my face neutral, though I was almost smiling inside. I'd seen it coming from a mile away. Kyle, the golden boy, the tech-driven genius, was learning the hard way that there was no substitute for experience and trust in this business. And now it was starting to crumble. Tom leaned forward, almost nervously. "They need someone to step in, John. They're looking for a partner, someone who can salvage what's left. Kyle wants to bring you back. He's desperate." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. The same kid who had humiliated me, who had cast me aside because I wasn't moving with the times, was now begging for my help. The irony wasn't lost on me. Kyle, the master of data and digital, was running the company into the ground while I, the so-called dinosaur, had quietly built something stronger, more sustainable. I folded my hands in front of me and took a slow breath. "You can tell Kyle that I'm not interested," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "I've moved on. My business is doing just fine without his innovations." Tom looked at me surprised. "John, come on. It's not just about Kyle. The clients—" I interrupted him. "I've built my business on honesty, Tom, on relationships that last. I don't need to save anyone's sinking ship. If Kyle can't handle it, that's his problem, not mine." Tom didn't know how to respond. I could tell he was caught between loyalty to the company and his admiration for what I'd built. But there was no hesitation in me. I wasn't going back. I'd made my peace with what had happened, and I wasn't about to sell myself out to someone who had never understood what I brought to the table. That afternoon, I got a phone call from Kyle himself. His voice was strained, almost pleading. "John, we need to talk. Things have taken a turn for the worse. I know we had our differences, but you're the only one who can help me turn this around." I listened to his spiel for a few minutes, hearing the desperation in his voice. He was trying to sell me the dream, a partnership, the chance to come back to where it all started. The words were slick, rehearsed, but the tone was different this time. It wasn't about the company anymore. It was about saving his career. "You've got a lot of nerve calling me, Kyle," I said, my voice cutting through the phone line. "You made it pretty clear that I wasn't welcome anymore. You made sure I wasn't part of the new direction. So no, I'm not coming back." There was a long silence on the other end, and I could practically hear Kyle's wheels turning. He was stunned, but he tried to mask it. "Well, I'm sure we could figure something out," he said, his voice shaky. "We can negotiate terms, make it worth your while." I smirked. "You're right about one thing, Kyle. We could negotiate terms. But I've already got my terms, and they don't include you." There was a defeated sigh on the other end. "I get it. I I thought I could make it work, but I guess you were right all along." I hung up the phone without another word, feeling a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't felt in years. The tables had turned, and I wasn't looking back. A few months later, things had settled into a rhythm. My business was thriving. My clients, many of whom had been with me since the beginning, were still loyal. And more importantly, the clients that had once been under Kyle's watch started to trickle into my office. Word had gotten around that I was a man of integrity, someone who didn't just chase the next trend, but focused on what actually worked. I had come full circle. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving on my own terms. The funny thing was, I didn't need Kyle's approval. I never had. As I stood in my office one evening, looking out the window at the city, I realized something. Age wasn't a hindrance. It was an asset. My experience, the years of navigating this industry, the relationships I'd built, all of it had given me an edge that Kyle could never understand. His so-called new methods had fizzled out, but my steady, reliable work had stood the test of time. I wasn't a relic, I was a force, and in the end, that made all the difference. And with that, my business was no longer just a story of survival. It was a story of triumph. Not because I beat Kyle, not because I made a ton of money, but because in the end, I proved that experience and hard work will always win over the latest trends.